Thank you. We've had a lot of talk about gas supersaturation. I'll try to put it in perspective. This is how it happens. Air bubbles, when they're forced down into the water column, the pressure on the outside pushes gas out into solution in the water. So the bubbles that start out large up at the top are getting smaller all the way down as more and more gas is pushed into the water. So you get down to the bottom where the water at 100 feet depth is at 72 pounds per square inch. The gas is there, or the gas that's in the water there is in solution at the normal for that depth. But as it rises up and it's staying in solution, the pressure reduces and then it becomes supersaturated. In a natural situation like this stream, there are still lots of bubbles, but they're not going down to depth and not being forced into solution. At a spillway, this is what happens. Water coming over, and this would be a spillway where the water coming over the spillway is at normal water, normal saturation level. It comes down and rolls back on itself, and as it does, it entrains air that comes down, and is carried down to depth. So any bubbles that are in there are then forced into solution. One of the points that was made was that in the area right below the dam is where it's the highest, right? It would be right in here. And it can be up to 150%. It's only 150% if it comes back up to here.
John?
Yeah.
Microphone.
Oh, okay. Sorry. You'll have to excuse my changing someone else's art kind of made my story. But anyway, that's what it is. When it goes into solution, it stays in solution. Now this would be in a reservoir downstream, and there's only one place for the gas to come out, and that's at the surface of the reservoir. And so it doesn't come out, it stays in solution, and it stays in solution for miles going downstream. The gas supersaturation catastrophe started at John Day Dam. This is a modern picture of the dam, but when it first closed in May of 1968, there was only one turbine in operation, and the whole rest of the river was going over the spillway. So total gas from there on downstream was up to 145%, all the way down to the Dalles Dam. And if they had spill at the Dalles, then it was on down to Bonneville and below Bonneville. This is from research that was conducted at the time, and gas supersaturation was considered to be a life-threatening catastrophe for the salmon runs for the Columbia and Snake River. This is from a 1968 report, and if you look up here in the pink, what I'm getting at is that the gas supersaturation in the spillway, stilling basin, is the highest, and it reduces only slightly going on downstream. And during the high flows, well, let me go back up to my slide and talk in. So they said the future was really bleak because Lower Monumental Dam this was 1968, it was coming online in 1969. It was being built with 3 turbines, but only one of them would be available in 1969, then one in 70, 171, that sort of thing. Okay, in 1970, you had Little Goose coming on, same sort of thing. It was going to take several years for those 3 turbines to be available. And Lower Granite was coming on in 1975. Well, gas supersaturation was really considered to be a threat to the survival of the Columbia River salmon. The other thing I'd point out is during the spring flows, sometimes up to 200,000 CFS had to be spilled. And at that rate, the gas supersaturation would be up in close to, well, it'd be in that 145% range in the stilling basins and 125, 135 going downstream. This would go then, when Lower Granite was completed, where it started, all the way down to below Bonneville. And it was still measurable at high levels down in Portland and Vancouver. These are some of the symptoms that you see on juvenile fish, the bubbles, gas bubbles, in the gill rays. Over here, in the mouth, on adults, in the mouth, on the eyes, on the operculum or the gill covers. And this is some of the research, some of the information that they published at the time, which was that they were testing to see how long it took for the fish to die, 50% of the fish to die at 115%, how many hours? 526 hours. At 120%, 46 to 80 hours. 17 and a half hours at 125%. At 130%, 7.8 hours. So you see it gets worse as the gas saturation gets higher. The fish counters were observing fish coming up the river at John Day Dam that had many observations of gas bubble disease symptoms. Something that we don't hear much about now, but they did do then, was they looked at what the result was to the spawning ground counts. And this is from Idaho Fish and Game spawning ground counts, indexes that they explain how they're figured here, but the main point is that when they had that high gas supersaturation in those 2 years, the spawning ground counts went way down. Okay, what were the remedial actions? One of them was to put spillway deflectors on the spillways. And what they did was put a little ski jump down near the water level of the tail race, and the water would come down and it would skate across the surface. So it wouldn't plunge down depth and it wouldn't get as much gas entrainment in the water. Another one was called slotted bulkheads, and this, when the Lower Snake River dams were built, each one of, well, Ice Harbor, Monumental, and Goose each had 3 what they call skeleton bays. They were parts of the powerhouse that were built without the turbines installed. So they came up with this idea of putting in some slotted bulkheads. There were steel bulkheads, weighed about 100 tons apiece. And they had funnel-shaped openings, and they dissipated the energy as the water went out, and it could go on out through the tail race, the tail race of the turbine, without adding any gas. But it was tested in a lab the year before they implemented it, and they shot fish into a tank at 45 miles per hour, and they weren't injured. So that was how these were estimated to work, 45 miles an hour. What they didn't take into account is the shear lines between the jet and the water that was roiling around the slotted bulkheads. And I guess I was in the office one day and I got this call after I know I was going to tell you. They spent $11 million and they built 3 sets of these for each dam, Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and they installed them. I was in the office when the juvenile Chinook population started moving. They moved earlier than the steelhead. The juvenile Chinook started to move, and I got a call from U.S.A.C.E. U.S.A.C.E. was at that time, National Marine Fisheries Service biologist. He said, "John, you got to get out here right now." So it's an 80-mile trip, 2-hour drive, so I drove out to Lower Granite, and there were windrows of dead juvenile salmon along the shore. They didn't know that the sheer plains between those jets of water would be very, very, very deadly to the fish. So they immediately took them all out of service. National Marine Fisheries Service biologists went to the Seattle Times, and look what the stupid Corps of Engineers did. Remember I talked about this earlier, about collaboration? His name was Howie Raymond. Howie Raymond was at the meeting where the decision was made in collaboration with the fishery agencies to put in those slotted bulkheads. Okay. The next thing that they did was expedite the contracts for putting in the 3 additional turbines at each of those dams, and extended the contract at Granite to get them all up to 6 turbines to maximize the amount of flow going through the powerhouse. Then I was in the meeting, a collaboration meeting, when the general from Portland walked in and said, okay, I'm making you a promise right now. We're going to maximize generation, we're going to minimize spill, and it will keep the gas supersaturation down. There was expedited development and acquisition of juvenile fish transportation trucks and barges with, as Dan explained, gas supersaturation measures. And there was expedited development of screen bypass and collection facilities at the dams to expedite the juvenile fish transportation program. There have been 3 objectives of juvenile fish transportation. One was to avoid passage through turbines. One was to avoid delay caused by the reservoirs. And the third one was to avoid predation. So a 4th one was added, to avoid gas supersaturation. So you now have 4 objectives for transportation. Okay, how does it work? This, I wanted to point out, this is what a flip limits look like. One of the other things that's been done here is to develop surface bypass so that you get away from, you can bypass fish over the spillway without that water plunging down to depth and being supersaturated. The surface bypass is designed to operate at Lower Granite, Goose, Monumental, Ice Harbor, at between 7 and 10,000 cubic feet per second. The flip lips are effective for flows up to 10,000 feet per second, and then the flow is too great and it plunges over and goes down to depth. So if you go to a mass spill program where you're spilling over 10,000 CFS per spillway, then you're causing gas supersaturation beyond what you need to have. So, what happened? Fast forward to 2000. At a TDG, Total Dissolved Gas Management Workshop in Seattle, a Fish Passage Center representative proposed spill to 125%. The people who were there, who had lived through this litany of things I was telling you about, rejected that out of hand. If you go forward from there, then the fishery agency started looking at various methods of spill to get fish past the dams. There was a lawsuit in the 1990s against the Corps of Engineers for creating gas supersaturation and for increasing temperatures. I was in that lawsuit as a testifier for the Corps of Engineers, and the judge put all of us fisheries experts in the jury's panel. And the judge said, okay, we all agree now, spill is the safest way to get fish past the dams, isn't it? This was Judge Redden. And I said, no, sir, I don't agree. Spill is not the safest way. And if I had time, it was good, I could have shown you a lot more about spill, of why it's not, why it's detrimental. Anyway, then we go through to 2006, and the harvest managers and judge have agreed that it's safe to spill fish up to 120% total dissolved gas. 2019 to present, they've decided it's safe to spill fish up to 125%, and it's enforced by, again, a federal judge, this time Judge Salmon. So now the river from Lower Granite Dam to the estuary is operating at about 125%, but in the stilling basins up to about 145%. And like I said, when the gas goes into the water, it stays high down to the next dam. It may drop a few percentage points, but the experience we had in the 1970s was a few percentage points. It's that way for 400 miles. So adult fish have to swim into 400 miles of gas supersaturated water, and juvenile fish that stay in the river have to travel down through 400 miles of gas supersaturated water. Well, okay, here we are, we've seen this before. Here's what it looks like when we had 120% and when we had 125% up to 2024. Now you might misinterpret this and say, well, these are peaks of returns of adults. But like Fred clearly showed, the return of adults is 4 years after that juvenile group went down. The states, well, going back to when gas supersaturation first became a problem, they wanted to set the supersaturation rates at the dams at 105%, because that's what's, if you go 105% or get up around 105% in shallow hatchery troughs, for example, it can be lethal to fish. But water was coming out of Hell's Canyon at 108%, so he couldn't set it at 105. So in the early 70s, the Environmental Protection Agency, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington set their standards at 110%. That's instantaneous, not to be exceeded. Then we had the 115% situation, and now they went to 120% situation. Now we're up to 125%. I wanted to explain that when each one of these dams is designed, they're designed such that everything is modeled, and the locations of fish entrances and so forth are set by these modeling results, and I'll talk more about that in my next talk. But this is what it looks like when you have more or less balanced flow coming from the powerhouse and the spillway. It's all flowing downstream, and the fish coming upstream are led to the fish passage entrances. This is a test that was, well, here's the same sort of situation at Ike's Harbor Dam, where you have powerhouse loading and spill loading and access to the fish ladder entrances. But if you have no powerhouse loading and all of the spill going over the spillway, it sets up a big eddy here. Well, in that modeling, the entrances to the fish ladders were established with powerhouse flow and with spill flow, and were placed in the most likely locations for the fish to find those entrances. When I went to work for the Corps, they had a contract with Chuck Youngie and Bert Carnegie with the Oregon Department of Fisheries to establish the best spill flow patterns to maximize adult fish passage. Those studies have just been totally ignored with what's going on today. This is the adult crab at Lower Granite. I don't know what kind of fish that is, but she likes it. That's a nice clean steelhead, a wild one too. all of the fish go through the lower granite trap. If they have a piece of metal in them, like a nose tag or a sonic tag or a pit tag or a fish hook, they trip a gate that puts them into a tank where they're held and they're sampled. This is looking at the juveniles. Oh, they also sample the juveniles down below the dam, well, at the juvenile fish facilities. Fred and his wife were both fish condition experts, one at Lower Granite and one at McKern. But they look for exposure, gas supersaturation symptoms like damaged eyeballs, bubbles in the skin, bubbles in the operculum, and so forth. One of the things that was noticed, and this was back when, before we got into these field programs, was that many of the fish, when they were having spill, were coming in with what they call headburn. I noticed in one of the other pictures that Jerry or someone had that they had a scalp there. When those fish are coming up, gas supersaturation has an effect on them like you or I drinking alcohol. So their ability to avoid things are reduced. When you have spill, generally if it's not a very wide slot in the spillway basin, or in the stilling basin, between the gate and the sill, if that fish goes under, that may be where they're getting scalped, because they're going down under a sharp surface. Another option is that when they go up a fish ladder, they go through 100 orifices in rising 100 feet over a dam, and they may be getting scalped there. The point is that they are being injured by the gas supersaturation. So, in 2000, the federal agency's environmental impact statement found that improving operations, facilities, and passage survival for adult and juvenile salmon was the preferred alternative. That came out, it was published, we were working on it in 1998, and it was published after I retired in 2000. In it, and since then, the National Marine Fisheries Service, because of the Environmental Protection Act, has required closer and better control of harvest in the ocean, lower river, and upriver sport harvest. The state agencies have adopted catch and release of ESA listed fish so they can continue to fish on hatchery stocks. One thing I didn't mention is in the Lower Snake Fish and Wildlife Compensation Plan, what was built into one of each of those 11 hatcheries that resulted was an amount of fish that were being provided for harvest. And the same with the Warshak hatchery. So that was okay. But if you're catching and releasing endangered fish while you're trying to harvest the ones that are marked, a certain percentage of those aren't going to survive to spawn. So I'll just leave it at that and go on with this next issue. This is what it looks like with gas supersaturation. And I know Melissa's going to talk to you a lot more about this, but this is a graph that was provided by one of the members. And this I don't know about light, it's not very big. I need your big green one, David. Anyway, this is what it looks like with spill to 120%. But you see in here, there's a problem area. Some of the fish are being either killed or injured in such ways that they would die prematurely. You go to 125%, look at the gap. But that's the way the fisheries managers are operating the river right now. And immediately below the spillway, that gets pretty ugly. So let's look at what happens with smolts at 125%. Fred talked about that. I just put it in a little different perspective. Let's say that you're still at 110% in the Snake River. What's the survival to the estuary? Still at 110%, let's say that you're collecting and transporting 90% of the juvenile fish that are going through the powerhouse. They're surviving at 98%, or they're 88% of them make it to the estuary. The other 10% are going over the spillway, and 50% of them make it to the estuary, so you have 93% survival to the estuary. If you spilled 125% and you're only collecting and you're having in-river passage of 50% of the fish, 45% of them. I guess I'm confusing myself. Maybe I made a mistake. Anyway, if you have spilled to 125%, you only have around 50% getting to the estuary. Okay. Remember, when we talked about what was happening to the fish, the adults going upstream, and I put this in to reaffirm this, and say Bonneville Dam, from Lower Granite to Bonneville Dam, it's over 400 miles of there is supersaturated water. Oh, someone wanted to know what the cost of spill was, so I just briefly wrote this up. Spill in the pretext of saving juvenile salmon doesn't produce electricity. Fred made that pretty clear. Bonneville Power Administration has documented hundreds of millions of dollars in lost generation and purchase of power to replace power that was lost. Dam spillways that were designed to operate with water over the spillway and water through the powerhouse, in other words, they're operating more with water over the spillways, are being damaged, and the extended mass spill causes erosion of the stilling basins, requiring more frequent and expensive repair. Fred, save time.
Thank you, John.